This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is freelance photographer Mark Bolton. Mark photographs gardens and interiors for editorial and commercial clients, and after purchasing a house in Devon, he decided to create his own picture-perfect garden. He chose the cottage style of gardening to fit the bill. So listen on to find out how he created his perfect space and tips for how to create your own picturesque paradise.
I've always, since I was a child, been really interested in nature. So when I was really young, it was birds and wildflowers, in fact. But photography came just after that, when I was more of a teenager, late teenager. And then I went to college to do photography. And I sort of fell back into the garden bit as a result, actually, of becoming an interiors photographer, because I was really interested in house interiors, decoration, that sort of thing. And the magazines that I worked for, Homes and Gardens, Ideal Home, things like that, that I started selling features to, I suddenly thought to myself, well, actually, I could probably do the garden as well, because it's a lovely garden or whatever, and I can go and make another feature out of that. I am self-employed, and it's that's the way I work. I find features for magazines a lot of the time. So the gardens came out of the interiors part of it, and then we bought our first house and had a little garden. I just became obsessed with gardening, and I had an allotment when I lived in Bristol for 20 years. And when we moved here to South Devon, I've had 2 different gardens down here, and it's just always been something. My parents are really mad gardeners, so it's sort of in the blood, I think, really. So gardening, photography, they come together rather nicely, really. So I do I seem to have a rather nice life in terms of work with gardens and photography. So my 2 favorite things.
Yes, I'm very jealous. It sounds amazing.
If only we could somehow join cider and cricket into it as well, then it would be an even more perfect job. But I can't imagine what that job would be. So.
Yeah, maybe the cider. I'm not sure about how you shoehorn the cricket in. But... So you've got a book out.
Yes.
And it's called A New Cottage Garden, which might give the game away somewhat. But can you tell me what your book is about?
Well, it's when we moved to our house here in the village. It was from another house further away in the village, but the garden that we inherited was just a patch of rough lawn, and with a kind of rudimentary border around the edge, the usual sort of thing. And when we moved it, I just thought it was it's sheltered on all 4 sides. It's got a sort of nice high hedge on 2 of the sides, and then a wall on one side. Small, but perfectly formed, square, pretty much. And I just thought, well, it was an opportunity to build a garden which I could photograph, specifically to photograph, because it was starting from scratch. So I tend to spend a lot of time driving on motorways for miles and miles and miles every week. And I just thought it was a good opportunity to try and stop having to drive quite so far all the time and use my own garden as a sort of outdoor studio. And I thought, well, what sort of style would it be? And it's a cottage that we live in. So I thought, well, it's got to be a cottage garden, which I've always loved photographing. They're the most, to me anyway, the most sort of photogenic of gardens. I know a lot of people would say perhaps a more formal garden or a more kind of modern garden might be more photogenic, but actually it's the plants that I love and the combinations of plants and that sort of thing. So a cottage garden's perfect for what I do. And I happened to be in London doing something else, and I bumped into the publisher's Pimpernel, Joe at Pimpernel, and I mentioned it to her that we'd moved house and I've been building a new little garden without even thinking about a book of any sort, really. And she just said it. She said, why don't you do a book, basically? Suggested the idea, and I went with it a little bit, and it just sort of took hold, really. So it then the garden design became a little bit more obvious, because I needed to photograph it for the book. So I needed certain things in there which might look nice as a photographic book. So it's focal points and arches and things like that. So that's how it sort of started and built, really.
And you say in your introduction to the book that you feel that the most photogenic of all are the cottage gardens, and I'm quoting you there. I don't disagree, and I'm sure a lot of people listening wouldn't disagree either, but why do you feel that is?
For me, there's nothing looks more lovely and more kind. I get excited when I see a crusty old bench with some honeysuckle growing through it and over it and up and around it, with a nice rickety, crazy paved path leading to it or whatever. It's just slightly traditional, I know, but those are often the sort of pictures I end up taking and loving, really. So I've never particularly gone for the much more modern and more highly designed gardens. But having said that, I go to Chelsea every year and I'm faced with those every year, and I can turn my camera to those. But my personal favourites are, I love the plants, really. That's the main thing. If I could, I'd make my living just photographing the plants rather than specifically gardens. But you have to be capable of doing both to sell to magazines. They don't generally just want the plant pictures. So, but the plants in a cottage garden are very lovely, very photogenic. You know, the foxgloves and roses mixed together with, you know, an underplanting of catmint or whatever it is. You know, you can't beat that, I think. And it's good for wildlife as well, really good for wildlife. You know, it's the different flower heads and the different types of flowers that are in the cottage garden tend to be great for insects. And especially if you're gardening organically, you know, if you're not using nasty chemicals, basically.
It was interesting actually then when you said about rickety benches and that kind of thing. In your book, your house is fairly old. You've got some beautiful photos in there of Gravetide Manor, which has got this history to it around the manor house and the way the garden's laid out and how long it's been there. Does a cottage garden have to be attached to an older property, or can it just be established around a newer one?
I don't think so. I mean, a Gravetide is an obvious one to include in the book because it's hugely influential in terms of cottage gardening. It's the home of modern cottage gardening anyway. And no, it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to look like that. I obviously have included 2 or 3 gardens as inspiration, one of which is Gravetide, but no, not at all. There are a couple of pictures in the book of a garden in North London, in Highgate, in fact, which is a town garden, and it's a fairly nondescript modern building that's behind the garden, if when you're in the back garden, but the garden backs onto some woods in Highgate, and the owner has kind of seamlessly gone into the background, as it were. So she's, you know, her garden is an absolute wildlife haven in the middle of this massive city, and you certainly don't have to be the possessor of an ancient cottage to have a cottage garden. She's got what I would describe as a cottage garden. She's got modern garden furniture in it, but her planting is cottagey and it's done with wildlife in mind. She's got a lovely little pond which is filled with toads and, you know, lots of insects that come in as well. You know, get dragonflies and all sorts. It's brilliant. But no, I certainly don't think it has to be an ancient cottage to have a cottage garden. No, it's more the style really that's referring to, I think.
And also, you mentioned that you love to photograph the flowers, which I'm completely with you on that. I just love flowers. So is there a flower that you are always drawn to photographing, or are there certain flowers that you think, yeah, that one's always going to look like a winner, it's always going to work well?
I mean, I've got my favourite. Some things are by their nature more photogenic. They're slightly more architectural style plants. So, you know, lots of the globe thistles are great to photograph just because of their shapes and that sort of thing. Eryngium, you know, sea holly always looks great, I think. Slightly mad, you know, the blue leaves. I'm guessing it's leaves, or is it sepals around the flower head? I don't know. That's a sort of slightly botanic term that I'm probably not particularly strong on, but yeah, so those kind of architectural flowers always look nice. But in cottage gardens, I mean, foxgloves look amazing always, don't they? Roses, I'm always fond of roses. Honeysuckle, you know, those traditional ones. Hollyhocks, brilliant. They're just so kind of architectural and beautiful at the same time. So I think there's plenty of them. The ones I don't like, weirdly, are the ones that are, I'd say I don't like them, but in terms of photography, are the ones that are really low down, because I have to get right down with my camera. So, but that's just a logistics thing rather than the actual plant. I mean, I love snowdrops, but they're a nightmare. I always end up with stiff knees at the end of February. So, but all flowers are cool, really, aren't they? They're all nice.
They definitely are. And thinking about weather and daytime light, is there a good
Yeah.
time of the day, or it could be, I suppose,
Well,
tipping over into evening? Does it work well?
traditionally, sort of evening and sort of late in the evening and early morning in summertime, that's when tend to photograph because the light is softer and a little bit warmer. And what you don't want is the harsh shadows, the sort of deep black shadows mixed with the harshly lit petals or whatever. Never looks quite right. So always photograph early or late in the day, unless it's a little bit overcast, which could work as well. A little bit slight light cloud softens it, gives you, it's almost like having a giant soft box above you to soften it all. So apart from that, no. And all the seasons are great as well. It's quite like photographing in autumn and spring, just because I don't have to get up so early because obviously the day starts a bit later. So you can get beautiful light even on a sunny day in autumn at sort of, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Whereas in summer, it's more like 5:30 or 6 o'clock. So, yeah.
When you bought your house, did you actually consider the aspect of the garden and where the sun would set and rise, or was it just a happy accident?
No, I didn't really. No. We moved here because of the house. It's a lovely house and it's right in the middle of the village and it's near to the pub. And, whereas before we were right down on the coast, about a mile away, and it was quite remote. And during the pandemic, I mean, we virtually saw nobody for the whole time. So when we moved here, it was so nice to have a bit more life around us. So the garden came sort of second, really, but it was obviously an important part of it. I sort of knew the garden a little bit from the people who used to live here, and I can remember thinking it was a nice size garden. It's not too big and it's not too small, and it keeps me busy all the time. It's a reasonable garden. It's not too big that I end up worrying about the bit that I haven't done because I can quickly do the bit that I haven't done. It's quite manageable basically. And so it was slightly lucky really how perfect it's worked out. And it's very sheltered, which is really good around here because we get these massive winds off the sea. And even in summer, it can be quite windy. So we're quite sheltered here.
So, thinking about the sort of weather conditions and the garden, I suppose year to year, I think the good bits of a cottage garden is that you can change it. Actually, you can change parts of it, you can change planting combinations, especially if you're going to incorporate annuals. I mean, does your garden change much year on year?
Well, I am certain it will do, yes. I mean, the book took 2 full years to do, but I'm only in the third year now, and we started it pretty much when we moved in. So, as yet, this is only our third full year of being here. So I can't give you any benefit of hindsight or anything about whether things would change, but I definitely think it will change because I'm already thinking about, for instance, one part of the back border, which I'd love to change, which has just never really been right. And I'm going to do that in the autumn. But I think that's just normal gardening, isn't it? I mean, gardeners love projects, I think, really, a lot of the time. It's never finished, is it? It's never what you really completely want. So you're always going to do stuff. And I think that's part of the joy of it, really. I'd rather be out there than doing almost anything else, really. I'm pretty obsessed with it, always have been.
When you document the garden, obviously your situation is slightly different because you're working with the pictures that you've taken of the garden. But going forward, would you refer back to the pictures that you've taken and think, well, actually, that really works as a combination? I might repeat that. Or can you use your photographs as a reference to hone the
Oh
garden?
yeah. I mean, the whole thing about photography of anything, any subject really, if you get deeply enough into it, then yes, you look back at stuff and you're constantly thinking, well, have I got that right? Apart from the photographic part of it, I use the right technique there, or should I have, lessened the depth of field or whatever? Apart from that side of it, yes, it does help. It's really fascinating as well, actually. I look at pictures even from last year of the garden now, and I'm looking out at the garden as I'm saying this, and I think to myself, God, it was better last year there, and it wasn't quite so good there. And so the pictures, yes, they're always useful because I can refer back to them and I can think to myself, well, why did it look so much nicer last year? Oh, I can see because I haven't got quite so many foxgloves come up this year. So you're missing that vertical accent or whatever it is. So yes, they do help. I can also see the other day, for instance, I was looking at some of the pictures because I was sending them off to my picture library, and I was thinking, wow, the hedge has grown so much this year. And I'm thinking, well, that's kind of good, but also not kind of quite so good, because that's where the sun rises from that side against that hedge, and it blocks off the morning light the higher the hedges are. So, I will make sure that we've got a really good hedge cutter actually in the village. He'll come round and he'll do that in the autumn. But I reckon he needs to take off 2 or 3 foot at least of last year's hedge. So, yes, it is useful to check back on. And also, I've just come back from Hampton Court, and there were some brilliant pollinating gardens, small gardens that were done for insects and stuff like that. And there's some great stuff there. And I can look at the pictures that I took and think, well, I could bring that into my own garden and maybe not copy it, but sort of, take inspiration from how that's been done or whatever. So, yeah, it does help. It all feeds in, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And thinking about cameras, a lot of people nowadays will be taking pictures of their gardens on their phone. Are phone cameras adequate, or would you recommend anything else?
Well, I think they're more than adequate. They're amazing, really, phone cameras. I mean, obviously, I use a proper, in inverted commas, a proper camera, because the file sizes are much, much bigger, and they're raw files. I know you can shoot raw files now on a phone, but it's nowhere near as good a raw file as you get in a proper camera. But I need that for magazines or for book publications. So even though you can use the phone for magazine stuff, maybe it's the odd fill-in picture or whatever, they generally want more high resolution images. But blimey, for social media, for Instagram, stuff like that, the phones are incredible, really. So much better than they used to be, and really quite amazing what you can do with all the editing as well, and connecting it to the cloud and bringing it into your desktop without doing very much. And it's brilliant. No, I definitely think it's worth using them.
Thank you very much to Mark for sharing his knowledge, and thank you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 172, Cottage Gardens with Andrew Sankey, released on the 6th of December 2021, and episode 129, Eco Gardening with Joe McCurr, released on the 25th of January 2021. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.